Okay, guys, so Dean just showed up. He came from, where'd you come from, Midtown?
No, down on below Union Square.
So the UN convention is happening. Trump's got the entire city shut down. Nobody can get anywhere. But Dean came in the iBOT. He came uptown through Manhattan in the iBOT. His colleague Julie sent me a note that said, I'm running behind Dean, he's on the iBOT. And I told you guys, they might actually be serious. Sure enough, Dean just showed up with the iBOT, which can go upstairs. This facility does not have a wheelchair accessible area, so this is actually a great demonstration of why the iBOT is so important. So we want to bring you videos so you can see Dean and the iBOT in action. The floor is yours.
So I'm going to go up this flight of stairs, and I'll see you at the top. Careful with that camera, don't trip. Stairs are very dangerous, you know.
Dean, can anything else do this?
No.
Incredible.
But I'll just stand around for a second and watch him come up the stairs. I am worried, I don't want him to trip. But,
now just to demonstrate, when we greeted each other today, you still got this, Roy? You still rolling?
Yep.
You were down, right? And I think this is a really important thing that I've learned talking to folks who spend their lives in a wheelchair. One of the things they quickly inform me is you never get to look somebody in the eye, which has so much to do with dignity and empowerment. And so can we go back to where you were when you first got here?
yes, we can do that.
So Dean rolled up in the iBOT. Mind you, he's been on the same battery for over 2 hours, I think he said.
And it still hasn't come off fully charged.
And it still hasn't come off full.
Now,
So-
if I were a normal wheelchair user, I'd be like this.
Right.
And
Right.
you'd walk by.
I often come
maybe-
down and I'd shake your hand like this, but with the iBOT, what is that experience like?
Well, I'd rather not be patted on the head or treated like a child or worse, ignored. What I'd rather do is, if you're standing around and we're going to have a conversation, I'd like to stand around and have a conversation with you. That's a better way to meet a friend.
Absolutely. You actually gave me a hug. You were able to give me a hug from in the chair,
And
which is really, really mind-blowing.
it really is. And if you weren't so unbelievably tall, I'd be looking down at you.
Incredible, Dean. All right. This is incredible. This is definitely the cool. They've had some cool vehicles in here. I guess we can't even call it a vehicle.
No, I'll go with vehicle.
Vehicle?
Or an exoskeleton.
Exoskeleton or vehicle?
Anything but a wheelchair. A
Anything but a
is such
wheelchair.
a stigmatized piece of garbage that hasn't improved in 200 years. A wheelchair is a way to confine a person. A wheelchair is a way to say every curb might as well be the bars on a cell. Every stairway is what separates you in a parallel universe from your friends and your family. A wheelchair, just the word wheelchair, is such a confining, dismal alternative to somebody that wants to do it and walk around and have some dignity. And this thing will go through sand, it goes to the beach, it climbs. We've got video of a guy climbing at a ski resort through the snow. He's climbing up to get to the gondola with his monoski in his iBOT. He's getting to the gondola by climbing through the snow.
Incredible. So this is a place where you've got race cars, Lamborghinis, some of the coolest vehicles on the planet. But this is without a doubt the coolest vehicle that's ever been inside these walls. And the most important one, I would argue.
And those are for fun, and that's fine. This, we have an obligation to make available, certainly to every vet. And the day this country can't assure a veteran that if, God forbid, they give up a leg or two or for some other reason can't walk, If this country isn't prepared to say to them, we'll give you anything that's possible like this country doesn't have the right to send them off to do our bidding so that we can sit around here and have great debates. I'm sorry. There are a lot of tough questions about who deserves what in healthcare. There's one that's not a tough question. If you ask people to go and put themselves in harm's way, you better be prepared to take care of them when they come back. And over a 5-year life, the cost of this versus the junk they have, it actually is less. You didn't have to modify a house. You didn't have to buy them a special van. They can keep their job. They can live with their family. They're not going to be taking antidepressants. I don't understand how people that should understand all this stuff haven't embraced this already, but we need your help.
Well, we're grateful to have you here. We're going to continue the conversation inside. Honored to have Dean Kamen as our guest this episode on Angry Americans. Stay tuned. Angry Americans everywhere. Welcome to the Manhattan Classic Car Club for definitely the most interesting, inspiring interview we've ever had. And in part because it's inspiring before we even started. And we're going to get into that in a second, but we are humbled and honored and thrilled to be joined by the great Dean Kamen, one of America's most inspiring, important people, I think. Really defined what it means to be, I think, an inspiring American, someone who is an inventor, a creator, a builder, a communicator, an educator. As a father especially, I have a newfound appreciation and respect for all that you do, Dean. But welcome to Angry Americans. Great to have you here.
It is great to be here. Looking at all these beautiful works of art and works of technology, these classic sports cars here in New York, on the river. It's great to see you. It's great to be here.
So I got to tell folks what happened before we started. So your colleague Julie sent me a text and said, we're on our way. Dean's in the iBOT, and I'm running behind him. Now, to set the scene, the UN convention is happening this week. Trump is in town today. So all of Manhattan traffic is gridlocked. You can't get anywhere. And you actually got here on your newest invention. And tell us what it is and why you and how you got here.
So we were down literally in Tribeca, and I just jumped in the iBOT and came over. And by the way, there's a lot of building zones along the way and interesting obstacles, but nothing that is a problem for an iBOT. My only problem was Julie was jogging, but she's not in as good shape as I thought. So it took us an extra few minutes to get here, but we certainly got here faster than we would have gotten if we used a cab.
And as a demonstration of what you're sitting in, I'm going to ask you to describe in a second, but we are on the second floor of a building that does not have an elevator. And you arrived in the iBOT, and you were seated. It's I'm not going to call it a wheelchair. It's an innovation. It's a groundbreaking vehicle. You can describe it for me, but you demonstrated it. You rose up out of the chair, to give me a hug, and then used it to climb a set of stairs to come into this room that we're in now, which is a driving simulator room. But if you can, just to set the picture for folks who are listening in audio, can you describe what it is you're sitting in right now?
What I'm in is what we call an iBOT. It brings you to eye level, and it's kind of a robot. In fact, 20 years ago, it was by far the most advanced robotic device ever reviewed by, for instance, the Food and Drug Administration. It's all fly-by-wire. It's full of gyroscopes and accelerometers. And the basic idea was, could we put enough gyros, accelerometers, sensors, computers, actuators in a system that would safely take the load of a full-grown human being, bring them up to eye level, and leave that system on 2 points on the ground, like 2 toes of a ballerina, because it's balancing. It doesn't depend on having a great big long wheelbase like a wheelchair or a car would have. It's up on 2 points, and you'd say, why bother? Well, while that's much harder to do than be statically stable on the ground, once you solve that problem, which took us a decade, now that you're on a very small wheelbase on the ground, your footprint is 2 points, then every Stair, you see, is just one more flat space. So you can climb stairs the same way a person does. You don't turn your body at 45 degrees perpendicular to the stairway, you'd fall on your head. You're vertical as you come to the stairs, and you're vertical on the stairs. You just go from one vertical plane every 6 inches to the next. We recognized more than 20 years ago, if we could simulate human balance and give a person a stable way to maintain themselves, even though their footprint is no larger than a foot, 12 inches. If we could do that, we could make a device that could enable a person to navigate all the architected environments you and I take for granted. And then we could have the thing come down to a four-wheel drive mode on a couple of these things, but still maintaining the balance capability of always keeping the person's weight above those points. And with that four-wheel drive, it can climb sand dunes. It can go through snow drifts. Nothing, virtually nothing that you'd want to walk through will stop it. We'll seal it. We'll let it go through 6 inches of mud and water. And so we spent years building a device that would essentially return to a person that can't stand up and can't walk a couple of very important things. The public, I don't think, realizes a lot of this. One of the important things we return to people is the ability to access wherever we want to go. It gives them certainly independence and access. It does all of that. What most people don't realize is the users of an iBot, almost without exception, will tell you the biggest thing that an iBot gives them back isn't access, it's dignity.
Yep.
They stand up. They can look you in the eye, and they're in a crowded place and there's conversation going on among their peers. They're not isolated. They're not down looking at everybody's navel. They can hear, they can see, they can interact. Think about our language. Stand on your own 2 feet. He's taking his first steps. Look him in the eye. Well, how do you do any of those things in a wheelchair?
Right.
And by the way, go ask your mother what she remembers about you as a little kid. And she'll probably tell you 2 things like every other mother. What I remember most about little Paul, his first words and his first steps. It's a unique and big deal that humans walk erect and we talk. When somebody loses the ability to stand up, maybe a vet that left his legs in Afghanistan on an IED, or 40 years ago, a vet that left his legs on a landmine in Vietnam, they come back. And when we put them in a wheelchair, we're telling them, oh, that curb, think of it as the bars on a cell. Oh, that staircase, don't even think about that at all. Oh, living in the house you used to live in and getting around, that's no longer feasible. But most of all, we tell them, you'll never be at eye level with your wife. You'll never be able to look your friends in the eye. No, you're down there, and you've been isolated. That's got to stop. And what an iBot does is it gives people back not just mobility, it gives them back that uniquely human capability to stand up.
And the dignity. That's really, as soon as you and I started to have this conversation, people in the club stopped and turned to look, what is that? Who is that guy? And then you made your way up the stairs at a pace that was, at first my initial reaction was, oh, okay, it's very methodical. It almost felt slow. And then I thought to myself, that's actually how an older person might go up the stairs. It's that pace, right? Which actually made it more deliberate. You had to concentrate a little bit, right? It wasn't just a passive thing. You didn't just glide up. But you worked your way up to the stairs and got to the top of the stairs, and I asked you to demonstrate it again, where you gave me a hug. You were able, when I went to first give you a hug today, you stopped, you said, hold on, and you raised the iBot up so you would be at my eye level, which, having worked in the veterans community, having worked around so many people that have been in wheelchairs, I know how powerful that is and how that gives them that dignity. And it's really, really inspiring. I mean, every time I'm around you, Dean, I feel like I'm seeing the future. And you see the future before other people did, but the entrance you made is really, really extraordinary. And part of why I wanted this show to be a conversation about what's happening in America, and why I'm always so excited to be around you. But I also, being Angry Americans, we have a drink to start the conversation, and I told you there would be a drink, and there is beer. So I asked Julie what you prefer, but what is your drink of choice, Dean? As you're doing all this innovative work, you also live a pretty amazing life in New England, in New Hampshire. Maybe we'll get into that. But what is your drink of choice, Dean Kamen?
Well, I like beer. It's just a really good, safe thing to drink. To me, it's the most important food group, right? It's got calories. It's a little bit of a sedative with the alcohol. It's got carbs. I can use some of them. It doesn't have a lot of sugar. So what I love about beer is when it's good, it's great. When it's bad, it's pretty good.
And we're drinking a Guinness. And you told me it was a pretty decent Guinness. Cheers to you, Dean.
Cheers.
To the iBOT. Now, you and I met years ago because of my work at IABA in the advocacy world. And I think, I don't know how it came to be, but I was introduced to your work. And I knew about the Segway. You are the inventor of the Segway. You've invented many other innovative things. I don't even know how to describe them, but they're game-changing things like the Slingshot, which turns basically any water into clean drinking water. But you were working with or around DARPA. And maybe for folks who aren't from the military community, can you explain what DARPA is, and maybe whatever you were able, the work that you were doing with them a decade ago and since?
So DARPA is kind of the advanced group of people that work on projects that are too risky for everybody else for the military. DARPA is the Defense Advanced, Research Program, and they're credited over the last decades with inventing everything from GPS to almost all the advanced technologies that we now take for granted that would have been too risky for the rest of government or industry to do. DARPA does them. And they came to me and said, the military has always been in the forefront of medical breakthroughs. Most people don't realize that. They pointed out that even in the Civil War, it was the military that figured out essentially how to practically deploy things like antiseptics so that bullet wounds wouldn't cause gangrene and eventually death. They invented better ways to anesthetize people during, sadly, the many surgeries people needed. And they made practical prosthetic limbs. But there I sit, 150 years after the end of the Civil War, with a colonel who's come up to visit me in New Hampshire. And by the way, besides being a full colonel, he happens to be a neurosurgeon. And he's sitting in my office in New Hampshire getting very passionate and saying, but Dean, it's great that during the Civil War in the 1860s, they would take an arm off a guy that was getting infected because of a lead musket ball, and they would surgically remove it. An advanced technique back then, save the soldier's life, but they would give him a wooden stick with a hook on the end as a replacement. He said that was pretty good in 1860. He said, now I've got young soldiers coming back from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and we don't give them muskets. We give them $100 million F-35. We give them all sorts of advanced stuff. But when they have to go crawling around in those caves, and they come across an IED that might take off an arm or two, we bring them back, we keep them alive, we do great triage, and we don't give them a wooden stick with a hook on it. No. We give them a plastic stick with a hook on it. And he said, you are going to give me something that I can give these young folks. And he didn't come with 1,200 pages of, that classic, they always say government. He says, you're going to give me something so that when I bring one of these folks in here, I'm going to put them at this conference table, and I'm going to put a raisin on this table and a grape. And the first thing they're going to do is pick up that raisin. So now he wants fine motor control. You can't do that with a hook. And they're going to pick that raisin up and eat it. So he needs to be able to flex at the wrist, at the elbow, abduct and flex at the shoulder. He said, then they're going to pick up the grape. And they're not going to crush it. Oh, now he needs afferent, efferent, haptic response. They need to know and touch and feel and pressure. And they're going to eat that grape too. And by the way, the thing you give me, it's not going to be any bigger or heavier than the original equipment, the arm that they used to have. and it's going to be able to do all these things for them. And I told him, really, you're nuts. But Colonel Lang wasn't nuts. He's a brilliant surgeon. He's a passionate soldier. And he told me we need to do this. And I said, great, we'll do it. Mostly because he hit me below the belt. He says to me, Dean, the good news is there's a very small group of folks relative to the whole country that need one of these devices. But Dean, the way IDs work, a small set of that small group didn't lose an arm. They lost two. Now, I don't know how well you deal with losing an arm, but compared to losing two, that would seem like an inconvenience. After telling him I thought he was nuts and that would be really hard and making all that happen and putting all those sensors and actuators together, I went home that night thinking, I've got my water project. I've got my first program for kids. I've got all that I can handle with my nights and weekends. And in my day job, I got hundreds of engineers working on dialysis equipment and all. How am I going to do this? But I rolled around in bed that night, reliving that conversation I had with Colonel Lang. And I started thinking, how do you roll around in bed with no arms? So I decided the next day to call him up and said, we're going to give you a solution that you asked for. We called the project Luke, as in Luke Skywalker, who you might remember from the first episode, turns out to have had a prosthetic arm.
Right.
And we spent a couple of years and we built for DARPA a prosthetic arm. And we got it approved by the FDA, and we've got them on soldiers now, and it's transforming what they can do. And boy, it's a little better than a plastic stick with a hook on it.
Oh, it's absolutely incredible. I remember the first time I saw them, to have someone have the ability to shake your hand. You know, again, going back to the dignity piece, shake your hand and not crush it, right? To be able to open a door, to be able to pick up your child, right? The things that so many people take for granted. The Luke does that, and I've seen it in action. I remember the first time I saw one, and I watched a room of vets and soldiers just captivated by this. But there's always a sense of wonder on everyone's face, and I think a sense of satisfaction on the face of the veteran. But I always watch the family members, and I see the face that they have, where you can see that now they can pick up their children, now they can do things. They have a sense of independence that they never had before. And there's the old saying that the only victor in war is medicine. And I think that is, if there is a silver lining of the last almost 2 decades of war, is these incredible innovations that you've been at the forefront of. But for you, Dean, it's more than just a challenge. It's a sense of patriotism, right? Can you talk about that and maybe where it comes from? You know, your backstory, you grew up in the New York area, and you've now risen to global recognition. You've been successful in business and in science and in education, but where does this come from, Dean?
So I don't know where certain kinds of drive and purpose come from. I'll tell you, my dad was a very humble guy. He's not a scientist, he's an artist. But my dad had a 2-year all-expense-paid vacation to the Philippines from 1943 to 1945. And he came back from World War II, like all the other vets, and just went about life, realizing how good life would be when you're not at war. He was a young guy that came back, married my mom. They were married for nearly 60 years until he passed at nearly 90. But I noticed in my father, in my uncles, in all the people that were adults when I was growing up, they had a commitment. And they appreciated what they did for each other. And I think a lot of kids, but not all kids, could appreciate what they did for us. As I grew up, I didn't end up being asked to take a 2-year all-expense-paid trip to Vietnam or anywhere like that. But I watched people of my generation do it. And I thought that whatever I could do to demonstrate that I also feel a commitment to this country and to the people that do what they do, I would do it. And it turned out that I've spent most of my life building medical equipment. So when I was asked to take the specific task of let's go build a piece of medical equipment that, while it might be useful to lots of other people in the population, we'll design it to meet the needs of the military. DARPA asked me to do it. Frankly, besides being a technical challenge, we were honored to do it. And when we had the first ones ready to get some feedback, I took a whole bunch of my team down to Walter Reed. And we visited a hospital there, and we met all these young people. And we showed them this arm. And before we walked in, I told all my guys, look, I know we're engineers and scientists and physicists and tool makers, but this is where the rubber meets the road. Now you're going to see what we do. But you need to know we're going to see a lot of young people, some of whom have been very, very, very recently brought back here from Landstuhl, from Germany. They still may have open wounds, and you don't want to be squeamish. But more than that, they'll have emotional wounds. And we need to let them know that we're here to help them. And we need to give them some sense that life's going to get better, and we're going to give them support. And I sort of lectured my engineers, you better be prepared to be positive, and don't be down. And they all said, oh, of course. I was so wrong. I've spent most of my life visiting hospitals, whether it's with dialysis equipment or other things we make. And frankly, you see a lot of people, many of them, fairly mature. And no matter what, sometimes they're grumpy or angry. They want to know why their knees don't work as well as they used to. They don't want just to fix that knee. They want to play tennis. They don't want to have their eyes work because they wear glasses. They want to, basically, people expect great things, and when they don't get it, they're grumpy, even if they're 70 or 80 or 90 years old, right? That's what you see in a hospital. You don't see a lot of happy, enthusiastic people. So I was warning my guys, look, you're going to see a lot of young guys, maybe some special forces guys cut down in their prime. And there's this guy that has a neck bigger and stronger than my whole body, but he doesn't have legs. He's going to be pretty bummed out, right? So I give them this little pep talk. We go into Walter Reed, and one after another, as we talk to all these young guys, oh, yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We're asking, which would you like, faster action or more force? Oh, that would be good. And finally, after probably an hour of meeting all these young people that just seemed to be positive and enthusiastic and optimistic, and they kept thanking us at the end of every sentence. I said, yes, sir, yes. I said, will you please stop thanking us? Compared to what you've done, we're here to thank you and show respect for you and show that we're going to help you. Oh, well, thank you for that, sir. They couldn't help it. But by the end of that meeting, I realized we weren't there to cheer them up and inspire them. These people were inspiring my engineers to do more, to do it better, to do it faster. But it's an extraordinary group of people, and sadly, most of America has no sense of how small that group of people is, how committed that group of people is, and how much we owe that group of people.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think one of the things I've learned from you is that your innovations, in many ways, to me, once you see them, the wonder and the impact of them are obvious, but the path toward acceptance is not. And I want to get into the bureaucracy and the frustration that you sometimes face. But before I do, I want to ask you one of the core Angry Americans questions. I mentioned it to you on the way in. We're in this place that's surrounded by innovation. You've lived so much of your career on things with wheels and things with motors and things that go. Dean Kamen, what was your first car?
So at the age of about, 17, whatever, you can get a driver's license. I got a driver's license, a monumental day. But I didn't have the money to buy a new car, and I wasn't going to take money from my parents. My mom's a public school teacher here. My dad's an artist. But I went off to a junkyard, and I bought, for back then, which was a lot of money to me, $275. I bought, even back then, it was an old sports car, an old 1963 Triumph TR3. And it had a few problems, like, no muffler, But we hauled it home, and we spent a summer rebuilding it, and I drove it for years, and it was a beautiful little machine.
Wow. Do you remember what color it was?
When I got it, it looked like a chameleon. It was rusty, it was green, it was yellow, it was red. We painted it ourselves, and it wasn't my finest bit of work. We painted it British Racing green, and we bought some seats out of a newer model TR4, modified the base so we could plug it in there. So I had this little hermaphrodite sports car, TR4 seats, TR3 mostly, and we rebuilt it and we kept it running for years.
Wow. And where were you living at that time in your life?
I was going up and back between Long Island, at my parents' house, and Worcester, Mass. I was at Worcester Polytech at the time.
So did you know at that point in your life when you were 17 that this is what you wanted to do and meant to do? At what point did that click where you knew? Because so much of the work you do is also focused on the next generation, and I want to get to the Lego work and other work that you've done that I think is so inspiring. But you know, for folks who are listening, we have people who come from all backgrounds, all over the world, all different age groups. But was there a moment, you know, for people who are either parents or maybe they're students, that was pivotal for you, Dean, in shaping this trajectory that you would go on?
So this may sound corny, but it's true. I had a dad who was not one of these pontificating, overbearing dads. In fact, if you ask me, other than what I'm now going to tell you, what advice did you get throughout your life from your dad? Not a lot. My father was a very quiet guy. He was born an artist. He was born an artist. He was an illustrator for the comic books of my day.
Yeah.
He ended up being the art director for the first, illustrated encyclopedias. Did
he work at Mad Magazine?
He worked for EC Comics,
Yeah.
Tales from the Crypt, Shock, Horror, Suspense, Mad. He's a genuine card-carrying, real illustrator.
Incredible.
But as a young kid, I'd watch him at his easel every day. He would take the Long Island Railroad here into the city, deliver his stuff, come home. After dinner, we'd go out and play. He'd go up and do more work. And one day, I think it was a weekend, I was still very young, we got up, we're going to go out in the yard and play, and the other kids are out playing, and their moms and certainly their dads are out playing with them. You know, they were typical, suburban. So they were the accountants and the lawyers and the marketing and the business guys that didn't take the Long Island Railroad. It was a weekend. They're out playing. My father is sitting at his easel, and I go up, and he's not doing his day job, he's painting. He wasn't doing illustration, he was painting. But I said, I feel sorry for you because all the other dads get finished with work during the week and they're done. You're always sitting here at your easel. My father put down his pen. I'll never forget this. And he turns to me and said, don't feel sorry for me, Dean. You should feel sorry for all those dads. Because, as you just pointed out, Dean, they go off to work. Every day they go off to work. And they only get to play Saturday morning. He said, I love what I do, and I do it all day. And that's why when Saturday comes, I'm here. And he looked at me and he said, you need to find something that you love to do. And you need to make yourself so good at it that you can make a living doing it. And then you'll be happy. And if you're happy, you can make your friends and your family happy. The most important thing you need to do is find something that you would do whether you were getting paid to do it or not. It's not a job. And I thought long and hard about that. Well, a number of years later, I had to repeat that story to my dad because I was off at school. Now I have an older brother who's a doctor, MD, PhD. My mom's favorite son, her first son, and he's a doctor. And I'm struggling in school. I never like being told what to do by teachers, parents, or anybody else. I'm trying to learn as much as I can, physics, math, engineering. I'm trying to work on stuff for my brother. Finally, going to classes and doing some of the required stuff that I didn't see was a straight line to the skills I wanted to develop. I finally said, I'm going to take a little time, run my little business, and I'm probably not going to graduate. Well, when I told my mom, a teacher, I'm not going to graduate, or at least not on time, she was not happy. So I figured I'd go get my dad to help me out, and he wasn't happy. And I looked at him and said, you're the guy that told me, find something I want to do, something that I can get good enough at, that I can make a living doing it. And I said, Father, I have no artistic skill. I can't do what you do. I can't draw a straight line with an edge. But I can design solutions to real problems. And as I'm picking up the skill sets of electrical and mechanical engineering, and as I'm learning more of the basic physics and I'm learning more of the basic math, I can apply these things in a way that can help people, that I can do professionally, and I'm committed to it. That's what I'm going to do. And he just looked at me and I said, you told me to go find something. I did. And as they say, the rest is history. I did quit school, but a number of years later, I went back. They gave me an honorary PhD. I was their commencement speaker, and I've now collected some of those honorary PhDs and commencements, and I've got a wall covered with recognition for that.
You've got quite a few. But you've always done it, your way. You've seen a path. Even, your entire operation is headquartered in New Hampshire, right? Which I love New Hampshire. I think it's an incredible place. I love New England. But that's a different choice, right? Some people might have been in Northern Virginia or somewhere else. You've been able to carve out a path that you see as a path to the future. But it hasn't been without obstacles. And even coming in here, you were telling me that you wanted my help in trying to overcome some of those obstacles. But you created the Segway. You created so many innovations that have changed the world, but yet you still face friction. So maybe this is the answer, it may not be, but Dean Kamen, what makes you angry?
Well, you pointed out that I moved to New Hampshire, and I think people think this is folklore, but it's the absolute truth. I grew up in New York. I love New York. I mean, look at this place. There aren't too many cities like New York. But when I started my business down here in my parents' basement, there was one set of regulations after another. And then I started realizing as I needed to hire people to help me, young people that have degrees in electrical or mechanical engineering are not likely to want to move here. If you're in the banking business maybe, or in the media business, you can do that. But I remembered being every weekend going into Boston to visit my brother, who was doing a guest residency up at Children's Hospital. And he would take me out to the car to put me back on what was then the Eastern Shuttle to fly back to New York. And I'd see a lot of the cars in the parking lot at Children's Hospital in Boston. And most of them were Massachusetts. But a few of them would say New Hampshire. I'd never been to New Hampshire in my life, but under every license plate that at the top said New Hampshire, the bottom said, live free or die. And I was getting so fed up with the unnecessary processes that had been put in place that did nothing more than slow down progress or make it more expensive. I said to my brother as we were getting into the car, how far away is New Hampshire? And he said, I've not been there either, Dean. He was at Yale at med school in Connecticut. We grew up in New York. And he said, it can't be very far. So I said, let's go. And instead of going through the tunnel to go back to the airport, we drove north. And within a half an hour, we saw this big sign that said, welcome to New Hampshire. And we visited, we got off the highway, we looked around, and I said, I think before I get so tangled up and can't move, I should take my little group of people up to New Hampshire and we'll build our future here. But people ask, why did you move to New Hampshire? And my serious answer is, because the license plates say live free or die, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. It's inspiring, and I've read about what you've built there, and how inspiring it is, and how it's become kind of a beacon for folks who are looking to make that impact and who share that spirit. And I think it's a very grounded, there's so many pieces of New Hampshire that are about kind of the foundations of this country. And inventors are always really a foundation of this country. And you have that classical spirit of the great American inventors. But Washington, D.C. can kind of be the place where good ideas go to die.
So how do you talk about where you are now with your projects, where you are with the iBot in particular? You're here in New York for a reason. If you can share that, but what are you doing now, and where are you focused now, Dean?
So in the very exciting side of what I'm doing now, and again I have to credit the United States Department of Defense for this one. A couple of years ago, the Department of Defense noticed and is very well aware, and I had this very frank discussion, including with people like the Secretary of Defense. Hey, for at least 2 or 3 decades now, the incredible results of basic research in med schools and in research labs around the country has really advanced our understanding of biology and medicine and life itself, that we have no shortage of miracles in roller bottles and petri dishes at universities, at med schools. And you can go to this one or that one, whether across the country from Harvard to Stanford to UCSD to Baylor. You cross the country and you can visit lab after lab. And this professor will show you, in that petri dish, I was able to make these cells produce insulin. I could cure diabetes. I'd love to put myself out of the pump business by giving everybody a new pancreas. And in this med school, in this lab, hey, look, put a probe in there and I get an electrical signal. They're making working neurons. And in this one, they're making cells that are a functioning nephron, a kidney. And all of these advances are just breathtaking. They would have been science fiction 20 years ago. But there I am at the Pentagon being told, but Dean, there's 20 years ago, they were showing pictures of a human ear being grown on the back of a mouse. That's a pretty famous picture. The public has seen it. And they're saying, but Dean, more and more great research is coming out, but where do we see? They're not making kidneys. They're not making livers. They're not making a pancreas. They're not making lung. That's an engineering problem. That's a manufacturing process. That's not basic research. And they said, so we, the Department of Defense, not the National Science Foundation, not the National Institutes of Health, not the ones that are great at funding this long-term basic research and medical research. No, we want to fund the ability to take these miracles out of the laboratory and bring them to scale. We want to bring the engineering, manufacturing community to the table to help transition these things from being essentially science fair projects to replacement organs. And particularly, it was the Department of Defense saying, we need skin, we need bone, we need cartilage. We uniquely need a lot more than maybe the general public does, but we need to turn it into high volume, and we need it soon. And they ended up putting a program together. We were asked to bid on it. We won it for in excess of $80 million. We got it matched by in excess of $200 million from industry. And it's been about 2 years. And I'm really excited to tell you that, a little over a month ago, in a completely closed system, we started to demonstrate what we told them. I told them within 5 years, we would be able to demonstrate a process that would essentially be a platform, an engineering manufacturing platform of the technologies necessary to manufacture replacement human organs. Now, we're nowhere near full organs yet, but last month we demonstrated a closed system that manufactured a 7-centimeter long segment of bone, ligament bone, that would be ready to start doing biological work on. And I think, as we told them back then, within 5 years, we're going to have a platform that is capable of bringing to scale some critically needed subsystems of full organs. And we're going to transform healthcare with that. It not only will give patients way better outcomes, but it will lower the cost of medicine. Nobody wants to be chronically treated with dialysis every other day. I make that equipment. Nobody wants to have to wear an insulin pump. I make those. Nobody wants these chronic treatments, but the alternative is without them, you're going to die. You accept them. But if you went to a little kid and said, do you want to keep pricking your finger and checking your glucose, or would you like to just have a new pancreas and be done with this? Would you go to a patient that doesn't have working kidneys and say, do you like going to a dialysis center every other day to stay alive? Or would you like a new kidney? We believe that if we could give people replacement organs as a cure as opposed to a chronic treatment, we will dramatically lower the cost of health care, dramatically improve the quality of life for these people, and change the future. And that's one of my day job projects.
Wow. Every one of your day job projects is mind-blowing, man. I mean, it's really, really incredible. Every time I see you, you're working on a new thing that will literally change the face of humanity, change the face of science, change the face of our world, and now literally change the face of people's lives. But this show, we've been covering so much about what's happening in the political world. You're operating in a place of inspiration and hope and innovation, and then politics seems so divided, so stuck. You know, recently here in New York and around the world, hundreds of thousands, millions of kids organized to bring awareness to climate change. So as a scientist and as a problem solver, I guess a two-part question. One is, what are your thoughts on the recent climate strike and this movement of young people? And then what are your broader thoughts on the state of affairs in America? Just as a leader, as an innovator, as someone who I think brings a positivity and tone to everything at a time when we're divided, what are your thoughts on where we sit as a nation right now, Dean?
Well, sadly, I think today, and the same thing I thought 30 years ago when I started a not-for-profit organization called FIRST. And FIRST is an acronym for inspiration and recognition of science and technology. You notice the word education's not in there. 30 years ago, when this country was totally convinced, and I mean our president, our corporate leaders, everybody was convinced we have an education crisis because we were producing far too few scientists and engineers. And they said, oh, it's an education problem. As I pointed out, my mom's a teacher. There's a lot of dedicated teachers in the country. I don't know anybody that can't think fondly about some experience they had. So to suddenly decide that the fact that we're not producing a lot of scientists and engineers, to suddenly decide that women, young girls, never seem to go in any reasonable proportion into engineering and study math or science, even in grade schools and middle schools. To suddenly decide all of that is an education crisis, I thought, is a substantial misdiagnosis of a much bigger problem. And I'm an inventor. What do inventors do? Inventors look at the same problems as everybody else, but see them differently. And I sat there, and it was an epiphany to me. I said, you know what? It's probably not an education problem. It's a culture problem. It's not what we don't have enough of great teachers, great schools, great education. We spend a lot of money on K through 12 education in this country. I said, it's not what we don't have enough, it's what we have too much of. Because we become such a rich country, we have something that I've never fully understood. We invented it in this country. We call it leisure time. I've never had any of it. But we have a country that has made superheroes out of people in the NFL, the NBA, the MLB. And there's nothing wrong with that. When you're a rich country, you can afford a lot of things that the poor can't. You can afford art. You can afford a lot of sports. But I realized that our culture had gone so far that particularly young girls and minorities, the only thing they see in our media, the only role models that are young people that are happy and smiling are professional athletes or professional entertainers. And you could walk out on the streets today, 30 years later in New York, and every kid on that street can tell you the name of some famous living football player or basketball player, and that's great. And somebody from Hollywood. But they know about the Super Bowl, the World Series, the Academy Awards. Can they tell you the name of a famous living scientist or engineer or inventor? Do the girls know that there are millions of jobs out there for young kids that develop the muscle hanging between their ears? Most of these kids grow up thinking, if I work really hard and I spend 10 hours a week bouncing a ball, I'll be in the NBA or I'll be in the NFL. And then they don't develop the core skills they'll need for all the exciting careers of the future. So 30 years ago, I said, hey, wait a minute. If it's really a culture problem, not an education problem, that's great news. Because we know what gets kids passionate to excel at something. Make a sport out of it. Get it out of the classroom. Don't make it something where the teacher's judgmental like they are during class, but that same teacher at 4 o'clock turns his or her hat around and goes out with those same kids, but is now the coach. And instead of having to give them a red mark and tell them it's a D or an F, no, after class when they missed the ball or dropped, oh, we'll help you. It was a lucky catch. But suddenly, you realize that everything about our whole education system, in fact, makes sports, makes entertainment, our whole culture makes that so exciting to kids. It allows for the failures. It allows for the nurturing of a coach. In fact, I was always amazed once I started first, and you know, I'd say to people, you got to let the teachers do this after school, and there shouldn't be grades. Well, what do you mean? And I would compare it to what they're supposed to be doing in class, and I said, a lot of people thought I was picking on sports. I said, picking on it? What do they say? Imitation is the highest form of flattery. I built first around the sports model, and by the way you all justify sports is you say, well, it's important that they learn teamwork. Well, if it's so important that they learn teamwork, why, when they do it in the classroom, do you call it cheating? So I said, look, we're going to just take everything we know that makes kids passionate and we'll wrap it around the things they need to become really good at. And in a free culture where you get the best of what you celebrate, we've got to start celebrating kids that want to develop that muscle hanging between their ears. We got to start celebrating the world of science and technology, and we got to show kids that it's every bit as accessible, every bit as rewarding, and way more likely to lead to careers for them than just about any other activity. So let's put it in the right context and let's go. And 30 years ago, I got some superstars and role models from industry. 23 different companies lent me some young, enthusiastic engineers to adopt a local school. Typically, I ask those companies, find a school where the kids have never met a scientist or engineer, where their dropout rates are high, and show them that we're going to make this robotic building exercise a short, intense season like football or basketball. We'll make it every bit as exciting, and it doesn't end with quizzes and tests and final exams. It ends with a double elimination tournament and trophies, and bring the school band and bring the mascots. Well, by year 2, we had nearly 50, then 100, then 200. In our 30th year, we have 72,000 schools. And our season, our March Madness season, had 173 cities holding events for all of these kids. And at the end of the season, in April, our championship filled the 50,000-seat domed arena in Houston. That was only half the teams that made it to the finals. So 4 days later, the other half went to Tiger Stadium in Detroit. And between the two cities, we had 100,000 screaming kids and parents and teachers and mentors, 3,700 corporate sponsors, 200 universities that handed out $80 million in scholarships. And we're proving. And by the way, 60% of our school teams were from Title I schools. And this year, something like 60% of all the new rookie teams had a majority of girls or were captained by a girl. So FIRST is becoming, I think, part of the culture in a very meaningful way that I hope will help shape the future. And by the way, most of these kids aren't going to become professional scientists or engineers. They don't need to be. But they need to embrace science and technology. They need to be able to separate fact from nonsense. They need, if they go into politics, for instance, or into government, if they can't understand the value of technology or the concerns we ought to have about it, they can't do a good job. They can't be a responsible leader. And these days, it's really a concern to me that when you go to Washington, you see a lot of people that have the authority to make a lot of decisions that will affect a lot of people's lives, but they don't fully understand the impact that technology is bringing to the world. And you ask me what makes me angry or frustrated? What makes me angry and frustrated is it might take as long to get appropriate recognition by the various government agencies like CMS that you need to make the iBOT available to people. It could take as long to get them to get to the right place as it took us to design and develop the technology. And that's sad and that's unnecessary. We need leadership in Washington that can appreciate the value of technology and look at it across the whole life cycle of the technology and its impact on people. But certainly making an iBOT available to somebody that can benefit from it, instead of saying, well, it's got motors, it's got wheels, it's a motorized wheelchair. We'll reimburse it like a motorized wheelchair. That is a terrifyingly oversimplistic view, and that could deprive particularly veterans from something that they need and they certainly deserve.
There's so much to digest out of that, Dean, that you need to take a sip of that Guinness. I'm going to take a sip. People are going to take a deep breath. When you were telling me that story about first, you were unfolding a 2019 Spectator schedule that actually has all the cities and countries around the world, Turkey, the U.S., Israel, hundreds, it looks like, of cities and towns that culminate in this great championship. And this is a robotics competition, right? This is what looks like, sports, right? It looks like college sports, but it's finally given the recognition and the resources and the sparkle and the excitement and the energy that I think it deserves. Is FIRST your greatest invention?
I think FIRST will have absolutely the largest legacy of anything I've ever worked on, because it's really not about robots. I've been telling people that for 30 years. We are not using kids to build robots. We're using robots to build kids. And in the 1940s,
That's awesome.
in the 1940s, when the world was in one of its episodes of self-destruction, it was the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, that said, it's pretty clear we cannot build the future for our kids. We better build our kids for the future. And I looked at the way technology is moving so quickly over the last 30 years, and I realized back then, if we don't get more kids to have a way to appreciate and understand and participate in the advances and the new careers that are being created by technology, if they're not on that bus, they'll be under it. And I think we've now started to get more recognition for that. But as I said, we are not using kids to build robots. We're using robots to build kids. And the corroboration that they have and the understanding that it gives them about the power of problem solving and of technology and the need for innovation, I think FIRST is absolutely the most important thing I've done. Because people say to me, what is FIRST really about? And I say, FIRST is curing cancer. FIRST is eliminating global warming. FIRST is, and I go down, so what are you talking about? It's kids playing with robots. And I say, really? So you think you or I in the next few years are going to solve all the world's problems with cybersecurity and access to food and water and healthcare? And you think we're going to do it? I don't think so. So who's going to do it? The next generation.
It's the farm team for the future, right? It's the farm team for America's future, for the world's future, right?
For the world's future.
This is happening in a political environment where there was a very powerful image in the news where Trump was speaking at the UN about climate change, and Greta Thunberg was over his shoulder, the 16-year-old Swedish activist. And there's this power dynamic, and she's been very aggressive in saying, you have mortgaged our future, there will be accountability. She's angry, right? And I think rightfully angry, in the same spirit of this show, that there are things that we should be angry about, and it's about channeling that anger into positive outcomes, and that's what you've built, and that's what you're doing. But you're also a leader, and you set the tone in your language and your example. What are your thoughts on the president? When you see this is a man who has been aggressively, I think, anti-science. You may not view it that way, but what are your views on this environment with this president? And just as a leader, what do you think?
So I think, to me, the whole debate about whether human activity is causing all of, some of, or an immaterial amount of global warming is a fool's errand. It's not a question that will get an answer that can be demonstrated by doing a double-blind test in another parallel universe. But why answer questions that are mostly rhetorical? I mean, as a kid, I remember being told philosophers do this and this, and I was told that philosophers look at that glass and ask, is it half empty or is that glass half full? And I remember thinking to myself, well, 1/2 equals 1/2. It's a simple truism. So the fact that the English language is full of vagaries is not something we should call philosophy. Get over it. I think we should look at that glass that has half of its volume with a liquid in it and half of its volume not, and say, is that safe to drink? To say, is there enough there for everybody? To say, if there's not, how are we going to make more? But answering stupid rhetorical questions, I don't have time for. In the same way, I would say, whether we're entering the next ice age or the next meltdown because of solar issues that we can't control from the nuclear furnace 93 million miles from here called the sun, whether the Earth is going through a natural process, which it might go through for the next 10 years or 10 centuries, I don't know. What I do know is, if it's going through that, are there things that we as inhabitants of this delicate little sphere can do to make our own lives better, and at least in the foreseeable future, the lives of people that come past us better. And by the way, if we could apply technologies so that, for instance, we can take photons coming from the sun and make them directly into electricity, so we don't have to drill holes in the earth, move oil, move it across a few continents, boil most of it to turn it into, put it in a truck, move it, put it in the ground, take it back out of the ground to put it in a car. You look at what we're doing and you'd say, whether humans are the primary cause of these global effects or not, it sort of doesn't matter, because if we can create better jobs, a cleaner environment, a more efficient environment, a more user-friendly environment, if we can create all sorts of technologies that create jobs of the future, careers of the future, opportunities of the future that are better than they were in the past. And a fringe benefit of that is we might reduce the carbon, because that might have been the primary cause of greenhouse gases being so devastating, at least in the short run. My real frustration is we let the politicians turn this big debate into, is the glass half empty, is the glass half full? If that's the kind of question you want to answer, you should go off to the debating society, but get out of the way. We should have serious technology people try to figure out how to optimize what human behavior ought to be so that we can all enjoy more energy, because there'll be 10 billion of us. Each of us needs more access to more energy without having have a negative impact, whether it's burning down rainforests. You don't have to get into those side debates to say, are there better ways to make energy? Are there more efficient ways to move people? And by the way, sitting in traffic bumper to bumper, one beautiful car like you have down there is a work of art. 10 million cars is a traffic jam. Let's figure out better ways, more efficient ways, more fun ways, more sustainable ways to use advanced technologies to move people around, to help them communicate. And it shouldn't be a compromise between, I'll either have a cleaner world or I'll have more resources. Good engineering, good innovation allows you to do both. And in every generation, we should raise the bar by giving people a better quality of life, a longer life, and more access to sustainable futures. And technology can do that. Politics can't. Politics is about a zero-sum game. You've got the oil, I want the oil, we'll fight over the oil. You've got the water, I want the water, we'll fight over. You've got the land, I want the land. And politics is about dividing the world into little regions that fight over things. If you think about it, the arbitrary lines on this globe are arbitrary. If you go into space and you look at this beautiful planet of ours, you don't see the lines. So if politics has been, since it came into be, a way to divide the world, technology is a way to unite the world. And if all the kids in the next generation learn how to communicate and cooperate and be on the same team, working together, they're all going to face needs for water and food and cybersecurity and healthcare and education. Let them all develop the tool sets so that instead of fighting over this or that scarce resource, let them all create new ideas. Because the difference between a world of things, whether it's water or oil or gold, where there's a finite amount, where every time there's another person, you either have a little less per person or somebody's taking it from somebody in that zero-sum game. How about if we have a world that's not about valuing stuff? What if we have a world that values ideas? And you have an idea. You know how to cure cancer. This is the formula. I have an idea. I know how to make a more efficient, clean engine. If you give me your idea and I give you mine, that's very different than you gave me your gold, I gave you my money. You know what's different before and after that transaction? Nothing. There was a fixed amount of gold and there was a fixed amount of money, we just moved it around. But what if you gave me your idea, now we can both cure cancer. And I gave you my idea, we both have cleaner engines. The world of ideas isn't a zero-sum game. And the more smart kids we can get on this planet that are racing towards more and more and more better and better ideas, they raise the overall value and wealth of the world. It's not a zero-sum game. And if we had a few billion kids that are racing towards solving these problems before we're overcome by catastrophe, the world would be a happy place. If we stay with a world that plays the zero-sum game of politics, we will have more and more people fighting over less and less stuff until finally we race each other to the bottom. That's not where we want to go. That's why I started first.
It's an incredible assessment and prescription for the future. We've had an organizer president, we've had a businessman president, now we've got Andrew Yang, who's trying to inject technology and science into this discussion. Maybe what we need is a scientist or an inventor president. Would you, Dean, ever run for office?
No, I know my limitations, and no. I would love to offer what I'm good at, I think, trying to think outside the box and work hard at creating incremental technical alternatives to what we do today that we could do better by integrating technologies that as the world, I didn't invent microprocessors or solid-state gyros or lithium batteries for this thing. I just systems integrated them. And some people would make video games, other people. I try to make stuff that matters. But I don't
so hard
think,
no on politics.
I do not think I would do well in the world of politics.
I have to ask you this question because since we started this show, we've covered a lot of issues, and some of them are kind of populist issues, things that are bubbling across the country that have people angry or annoyed even. And it's covered the opioid crisis, the lack of attention to the war in Afghanistan. It's also covered the lack of public bathrooms. And one of my favorite and most irritating subjects, the proliferation of electric scooters, which for me have become, I've called them the measles of public transportation. And when I made my case for why they've gotten out of control, now there's good things about them, but they've gotten out of control. One of the things people neglected to realize is that people in wheelchairs in places like DC have a hard time navigating them because they're just skewing across the sidewalks. But I cannot let you leave without asking you, the inventor of the Segway, what are your thoughts on the electric scooter invasion that has rampaged across not just the country, but now the globe?
Well, now you answered your own question why I don't want to be in politics. When I made the first Segway, and I've been forever known as the Segway guy, just for clarity, it wasn't the first balancing device, as I've told you throughout this conversation. I've spent most of my life making medical equipment, and my first application of solid-state gyros and servos and computer programs that could simulate balance wasn't for the Segway, it was for the iBOT. But since it took years to get it through the Food and Drug Administration, and I wanted to get the volume that would be needed to draw price and cost down, I said, let's take the seat off this thing that is necessary for the disabled community, take that same algorithm we developed, those same solid-state gyros and accelerometers, put a platform on it, and we could make this balancing capability available for everybody else. It'll drive the cost down. It'll be one of the first things I make that people will actually want to use. People don't want to use dialysis or insulin pumps or stents or prosthetic limbs. It's nice to know they're there when you need them, but nobody wants to be disabled and need an iBot. But people, perfectly healthy people, you put them on those early Segways and they smile and they're excited. So I made the Segway for whatever reason, because it was maybe more potentially useful to a much larger population, thank goodness, than iBots. I'm forever known as the Segway guy. But when we made it, I said, look, this thing has motors and wheels, but it's certainly not a motor vehicle. I mean, you don't want this Segway with grandma on it in front of a bus in the middle of a city or on a highway. But on the other hand, it's probably not going to be welcomed on a sidewalk because sidewalks were made for pedestrians. So rather than flood the world with them, as you've now seen people have done, there's a whole new philosophy. I think the philosophy of a lot of the new tech businesses in this country have been, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. Whether it was about privacy, whether whatever, just big tech companies have in many ways decided, I'm just going to do it, and I'm going to run at a pace that at best I'll ask for forgiveness. Instead, nearly 20 years ago, I went to Washington with the first Segway and said I went to the Department of Transportation, and I went to see the secretary. And I said, you don't really want to regulate this like a car or a bus or a locomotive? And he said, I don't. I said, will you give me a letter that says, although I have motors and wheels, I'm not a motor vehicle? And he said, yes. I then took it state after state, because once you're not a motor vehicle, the feds sort of say, you're on your own. I went and said, how can we define an appropriate, safe, responsible way to integrate this technology into a pedestrian environment? And city after city, we went and we came up with ways to do that. It took a lot of time, it took a lot of money. Well, 15 years has gone by, and once the cost of motors and lithium battery, once the price of a lot of things got cheap enough, and once people said, I don't need them to be safe and redundant, I'll just sell them like a consumer product. They're not very safe. I wouldn't build them. They flooded the country with them without any thought about the impact on safety or scalability. And I think the backlash has been significant. But I am not on the side that said flood the world irresponsibly with these devices. I think there is a role for government. To me, the balance is, and maybe it's the irony, I have always tried to do it exactly right. But meanwhile, while I think a lot of these companies have pretty much said it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, the flip side is I've been frustrated by the fact that if you come up with a radically new and better way to do something, the regulatory bodies and the legislative bodies don't move faster and faster. In fact, as the country gets bigger, as the amount of law and regulation keeps growing, if anything, like people, as you get older, you get more reluctant to change. As you get older, you get more risk averse. Well, a culture does the same thing. So technology is moving faster and faster. Innovation is coming faster and faster, particularly in the medical space where I live. But getting new things approved is getting slower and slower and slower. I mean, here we are in New York. Look at your subways. You go down into this tunnel, and you're standing on the edge of a concrete slab, the edge of which, with no rails, will drop you 3 feet onto a steel rail that's at 30,000 volts or something. And every few minutes, a couple of 100 tons of steel comes racing by. You could never suggest building a thing like that today. Today, government would assume you need multiple ways to prevent anybody from being near anything that could move or could hurt them. Government has decided people aren't smart enough to avoid getting in front of a moving train, rightly or wrongly. But we have way, way, way more risk-averse systems, which may be fine. In some cases, it's fine. But when you have a new medical advance that could be valuable to people, that would most certainly die without it, and somehow it takes many years to get it to a point where even people are allowed to use it, knowing how grim the alternative of doing nothing is, you start to think, maybe we've gone too far. Maybe the pendulum has moved a little too far away from being willing to adopt innovation. And I sit there as the guy that's trying to make innovations come faster and faster and faster, and as in the case of the iBOT, or as in the case of some of our other devices, we get held up for what I believe is an inappropriate amount of time getting through the political bureaucratic process.
I'm so glad I asked you that. I could do an entire series of conversations with you on infrastructure and regulation, and I hope whoever's elected president will put you in their very small cabinet to advise on issues of regulation and tech. You could run the FDA, you could run the Department of Transportation, you'd be a tremendous asset to any incoming commander-in-chief. But you've been a tremendous asset to us in this conversation. There's one question I always ask all my guests that I want to finish with you on, Dean. What makes you happy?
If you ask my father, he'd say, Dean is a human irritant. And my father loves me, I think. But he says from the time I was a very small kid, before I could communicate well with words, my parents noticed that compared to all their other kids, if I decided I was going to do something, whatever it was, I would fixate on it, and nothing would distract me from it until I either did it or I finally gave up. I don't think I'm ever truly happy because I'm always trying to do the next thing, and I always want it to happen better and faster. I think I'm chronically frustrated because I know I have a limited time on this earth, and I want to get as much done as possible. And I used to think, well, once I do that next big thing, I'll take some time off. But if you work on that next big thing and it's not working, you work much harder at it because you're falling behind and it's expensive and people are counting on you and you don't want to disappoint people. If you work on that big thing and it works, now you have more confidence, you have more resources, you did that, you got to work on the next big thing. So either way, I'm on a train that's going faster and faster and faster, and we all know where it ends, and nobody's in a rush to be there. But I want to get as much done, and as time has gone by, I now have over 800 engineers in my company. So I don't have a big project. I've got half a dozen big projects and a half a dozen small projects. And FIRST has now expanded, not just to be FIRST, but we have now FIRST Global. And I have 191 countries, each sending one team to Dubai around a month from now, from October 24th till October 27th. 191 countries will each send one team to our robotics competition. And the theme of this year's Global First is called, the name of the robotics game, the field, is Ocean Opportunities. And I don't want to play that same game we talked about where the politicians look for who to blame for what, and these think, oh, we'll just live in a world without plastic. Really? Try it. Or these others that think it's not a problem at all. Really? It's not a problem. They're both kicking the can down the road, or they're both unwilling to look for new and better ways to make a win-win. So we said, we're going to make ocean opportunities. And you look at the game, and symbolically, there's a bunch of parts in the middle of the field. And there's the 3 red teams on their alliance. We always randomly put the teams. So it might be 3 teams, like countries like maybe Israel and Palestine are on the same red team. And the US and Russia, maybe. But we have the 3 red teams and the 3 blue teams, and the game starts. Each round is 2 minutes. But during the first 30 seconds, all 6 robots, the 3 reds, the 3 blues, are running around that field, pulling the parts out, symbolically taking things out of the ocean. At the end of 30 seconds, the scoreboard captures how many total points were taken out. And that amount of points goes to each and every one of the 6 teams. Well, how can that be? That team barely got anything, and all 3 red teams were rookies this year in that particular random. Well, the reason they all get the same number of points is it's not a competition, it's a cooperation. And all these kids have to recognize they're on this planet together, they're sharing, and they all have the same common goal: clean up that ocean. So all 6 teams symbolically get the same points. But to make it exciting, to make it a competition, to make it so that the world gets the best of the best, during the next minute and a half, each team has to take some of these things, and if they can get them up here, that symbolizes recycling. It doubles the point count for each one of those. If they get it over here, it shows a reduction in use. And so each thing they do is symbolically showing a better way to attack a problem and a way to reward people that are innovative in coming up with better solutions. But I will have, for 3 days, the future of the world in Dubai. We will have these kids all working together, communicating and cooperating, because we're going to get to them before their parents teach them how to hate each other, to teach them how to literally do in the next generation what every generation before them has done around the world. This group teaches their kids their language, their culture, their religion. That group teaches them their language, their culture. And fine, you should keep all those things. Keep them at home. Have a good time. But you got to recognize there's one set of universal laws. It's called physics. We live on one big integrated planet. It's called Earth. And you guys have to live with some common understanding of all of that, and then go off and do your own stuff. But you've got to stop repeating the self-inflicted wounds of your parents and your grandparents and the culture that goes back 1,000 years. We've got to create the first generation of kids on this planet that recognize that we're all going to succeed together, or we're all going down together.
Well, I think any of us who've been able to hear you feel like we can succeed and feel like we are happier. And it does sound like all of your work brings you inspiration and energy and happiness in the spirit of what your father taught you many, many years ago. And we have one final phase of our interview, which is the giving of the gifts. So you can remain in your iPod or do some tricks in it. But we've got a series of gifts that we give to all of our guests. The first I will give you is a slight innovation in that it is some Angry Americans merchandise, but it's innovative because it's made by veterans and it's made in America, which is tough to do, super comfortable. I hope you can wear those and rock them on an iBOT or a Segway or any other awesome thing that you come flying by where I'm at in. And lastly, we got a couple of other gifts for you. Now, the first is we were talking about all the teams. This is a color quiz. There are 3 kinds of peeps. Classic peeps. Maybe not an innovation on the scale of what you've invented, but an interesting innovation and invention nonetheless are peeps. So Dean Kamen, if you had to choose one color, would you choose yellow, blue, or pink?
I'd probably choose blue. I've been wearing blue my whole life.
Very simple answer. And what do you think of peeps, Dean? Did you grow up eating peeps?
I didn't, but it's become a phrase that people use around my little company deck all the time now, because I have all my groups working on projects. Hey, how are we going to get to this? And almost a shorthand that people have, I'll get my peeps on it. And so the word peeps is used as a very positive way to say my team.
I love it. Okay. And lastly, we have been enjoying our Guinness, but each guest, I go to the same store each time, and I'll take this. I can hold your mic for you if you want.
Shall I open it?
Please do open it. Each time I choose a different selection that is inspired by the guest. And if we need to rip it open, we can rip it open. This is good for audio. The iBOT does not have a knife in it, does it?
I have one in my pocket.
I figured as an inventor you've got one. But I wanted to we pick an American whiskey each time.
Peerless Bourbon.
And I felt that this was appropriate because it's called Peerless.
And it's a small batch.
It is a small batch. It's made, but I think your work is without peer.
Well,
and you have truly been an American who has shaped the past of this country, is shaping the present of this country, and you're shaping the future. And I've really been so humbled and inspired to know you, and to be in your presence, and to just see the contagious positive energy you bring to people. It represents the best of this, what this country is all about. And you made the best entrance we've ever had on this show. You're going to make the best exit. If there was ever a time for folks listening to go to our website and watch the video, this is it. We're going to post the video of Dean's entrance on angryamericans.us. But Dean Kamen, you're an incredible guy, and I'm really honored to have you as a friend, and excited to see what you do, and thankful for all that you do for this country and for this world, man. It's been a real honor to chat with you.
Thank you, and it wouldn't be me if I didn't give you homework. Everybody I see everywhere in the world, I give them homework. And one is always find a way to get involved with FIRST, my robotics program for kids. And don't tell me I'm not an engineer, I'm not. We need parents, we need moms and dads, we need teachers, we need corporate sponsors. We need to get a movement so that every kid in this country, every school in this country has the opportunity to have a FIRST team, just the way they all have opportunities to have all the other sports teams. But we're the only sport where every kid on every team can turn pro. So you got to help us put FIRST in every school. And the second, which is much much more focused on what you do every day, and which is why you're one of my heroes. You need to get the community, not just the people that need iBots, but the people that need iBots. The American public that depends on our military, that ever-shrinking group of people that's asked to do so much. We need to get those people organized to make sure that these people in Washington understand this is not a luxury, it's not a toy, it's not a wheelchair, it's a piece of equipment that I think every disabled person in the 21st century that could benefit from it ought to get it in the richest country in the world. But whether you debate whether everybody should get one, there should be no debate that veterans that could use this will get one. And unless we have the appropriate political pressure, it may take longer to make that happen than it took to design, develop, and invent this thing. And that would be outrageous.
Hear, hear. All right, ladies and gentlemen, your homework has been issued. You have your marching orders. Get to work. The great Dean Kamen has really enlightened us and inspired us, and that will be part of your angry action this week, is to follow his example and follow his orders. And with that, he will exit us in great drama and inspiration. But Dean Kamen, ladies and gentlemen, live from the Classic Car Club in New York. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, my friend. Thank you, my